Now it is time for another discussion dedicated to the EU digital policy, the Digital Security Act. The aim of this format is to analyze the objectives of this policy and to evaluate the potential outcomes of the new regulations for the companies and for European democracy, especially with regards to content moderation, transparency enforcement, and online advertising services. Ladies and gentlemen, I am happy to introduce speakers of the next panel discussion. Karen Melchior, member of the European Parliament, Prabhat Agarwal, head of e-commerce and platforms unit in the DigiConnect at the European Commission, Siada El-Ramli, Director General of EDiMA, Eline Chivot, Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Data Innovation, and the session would be moderated by Samuel Stolton, Digital Editor at EURACTIV.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for that introduction, and hello to all our participants tuning in to this session all around the world. We're very pleased that you can join us here today for this panel discussion in which we'll be looking at the Commission's forthcoming Digital Services Act, as well as its impact on European democracy. Just as a side note, before we get started, I want to say thanks to Isabella and the Cybersec team generally for going ahead with today's conference under the very unique circumstances, shall we say. So far, I'm really impressed with how the forum has gone and how few technical issues there have been. So it's been a great job all round, and it should give us all a lot of confidence for the future possibility of events such as these. So today, of course, we're here to discuss the Digital Services Act, which aims to achieve a much needed update on the governance of online platforms by expanding the liability of digital platforms, by setting up common rules on online advertising services in the EU, and by enacting measures to curb the spread of hate speech and disinformation online. The new plans could help to reinforce the resilience of European democracies in the face of increasing threats. The framework will target a wide breadth of the tech sector, in particular social media platforms, search engines, and collaborative economy services. Now, of course, we can't discount the influence that the ongoing coronavirus outbreak may or may not have on the DSA, not only in terms of the content of the framework itself, bearing in mind the work that the platforms have or have not done so far to curb the spread of misinformation online, but also in the actual timeline of the DSA. And hopefully we'll be able to get a bit more detail on that today. So joining me to discuss this issue, as Barbara said, we have a very esteemed group of panelists with us here today, including Prabhat Agarwal, Head of E-commerce and Platforms for DG Connect, Karen Melchior of Renew Europe, MEP. She's also the Shadow Rapporteur for the Legal Affairs Committee for the initiative report on the DSA. We have Siada El-Ramli, Director General of EDiMA, of course, the association which counts Google, Facebook, and Twitter as some of its members. And Eline Chivot, Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Data Innovation. So just a bit about the format of today's discussion. We're going to start with some brief opening statements from our panelists before having an exchange on the finer points of the DSA, including liability, responsibility, political advertising, hate speech, platform definitions, and disinformation, particularly in the context of the Code of Practice against disinformation, which has been running, which began ahead of the European elections last year. We've got 45 minutes. And on top of that, I'd really like our participants to get involved in the discussion by submitting any questions to our panelists using the Q&A button on your screen. So without further ado, let's turn to our opening statements. And firstly, I'd like to go to Prabhat, who I hope may be able to give us an update on the state of play with regards to the public consultation, but maybe we can hear a bit more about that now. Prabhat, over to you.
Thanks, Samuel. I hope you can all hear me. Just if you just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, Samuel, and all the others. Okay, very good. Well, thanks for making this happen on Zoom and on video conference. I'm happy to hear that the day went smoothly, and I think you've already had my boss speak earlier today. So I'll maybe just want to make kind of three particular points at this area. So one, just as a reminder, and I think most of you will already know it, is that in the digital strategy communication on the 19th of February, the Commission announced an action under the heading of the Digital Services Act in two parts. One, to deal with the issues of safety and liability online with harmonized and smooth rules inside the single market. And that bases itself on the logic of the e-commerce directive, and where we are in the process of doing fact-finding around issues of illegal and harmful content. And that will hopefully result in a kind of proposal of the Commission by the end of the year, crisis permitting, on new and revised rules there, can go into a little bit more detail. So this is like kind of one part of the package. Another part of the package is that we are looking at exploring the need for ex-ante rules for some large platforms, and where we are have working together very closely with colleagues in DG Comp about contestability issues in platform markets. And this is in a way a follow-on from the work that we've been starting already in the platform to business regulation in the last mandate, and where since we undertook that regulatory step, we have been working with an observatory on the online platform economy, and we'd also been running a lot of research on the side to investigate some emerging issues around. So that's kind of the second complex of issues. Just to say that in the mission letters, this is not something I want to kind of go into a lot of detail here now, but in the mission letters, there's a kind of related issue of platform workers, which is also mentioned in several mission letters also in the President's guidelines. And in our public consultation that is hopefully forthcoming soon, this is something that we'll also be asking some questions about, without necessarily saying that this will be part of any legislative proposal or not. So that's just basically the introduction from my side. Happy to let the other panelists speak, and then I'll come back to more details in a minute.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Prabhat. While we wait for Karen Melchior, our MEP, to join us, I'd like to turn now to Siada Al-Ramli of EDiMA for her opening statement. Siada, please take the floor.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Thanks, Samuel, for that. Yeah, so obviously the DSA is an area that our industry is very interested in, but just to frame it, we have actually been working on some of the issues with regards and considering some of the issues with regards to content moderation for a good 2 years now. As we saw that increased attention was being drawn to issues with regards to content moderation, especially. The companies are doing their own initiatives. They're part of a lot of self-regulation, trying to get effective ways of dealing with it while dealing with some of the legislative barriers that we have as well, where we need some more certainty, for example, on what does notice and action mean, that kind of thing, and respecting the cornerstone, which is the e-commerce directive at the same time. So as I said, we've been working on it for a good couple of years, and it feeds in nicely, the work that we've been doing feeds in nicely with some of the considerations of the DSA. That work, obviously, what we're actually aiming for is beyond what was always the debate in the Brussels bubble, which revolved around the liability issue. The liability issue is something that we see as an issue of pertinence, but the limited liability regime is only one factor. The fact that the limited liability regime exists is a part of the e-commerce directive framework. And we think that we need to take this opportunity to be more ambitious than just focusing on that. And actually are encouraged that the Commission is also going to be investigating the issue in a broader context. We think that we should be aiming at getting responsibility online, not only for the platforms, but the platforms as part of an ecosystem of in the delivery of content. So we issued a paper to that effect early this year. to try to get the discussion going, not necessarily to say this is the only way we see we can go forward, but we are trying to open the debate with other stakeholders on how can we make sure that everybody acts more responsibly. What does that entail? It entails some initiatives by the companies, but with a backdrop of some safeguards to allow them to act, and with trying new things out. And that's the thing with a lot of the service providers rolling out both products and services that might have consequences that aren't even foreseen when they're really rolled out. There has to be a risk assessment factor from the starting point, but there also has to be a margin that we're allowed to fix as we go along. We don't see it as an issue that we have an end goal, but a continuous effort. And so that's why we're aspiring to having these safeguards to allow us to continue to try and fix things and make things better. And as I said, it wouldn't only be for the platforms, it would be for everybody that's part of the content dissemination chain. With that would also come oversight, because we know that in the current climate, there is an appetite for it not to be completely left up to industry to sort out, but rather to have some form of oversight, and then to get the legislative definitions in place as well, where we desperately need it to help us operate in a more secure environment as such. So that's in brief what we've been working on at, and happy to discuss further.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Siada. You touched briefly there on EDiMA's online responsibility framework, and hopefully we can get into the finer details of that and the differences between responsibility and liability a bit later on, as well as the points on definitions, legal definitions of the online platforms and so on. I'd like to turn now to Eline Chivot of the Center for Data Innovation to deliver her opening statement. Eline.
Yes, thank you, Samuel, and thank you for having me, and thank you for my fellow panelists' introductions. I hope it's all right that I thought I'd frame my introductory comment around the current context. We've seen that Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, Microsoft, Reddit, and Twitter have issued a joint statement announcing that they're working together to fight misinformation and fraud in the context of COVID-19 crisis. So I wanted to mention that because what we're seeing is that they are complying with the expectations of the Commission, which were to promote authoritative content and sources on their platforms, to share critical updates in coordination with government health agencies, to remove harmful content. And the Commission has been in regular contact with online platforms about stopping the spread of disinformation about coronavirus. And this shows to me that concerted action can be actually quite efficient. It also says something about how there would need to be some clarity from the regulators on the balance companies themselves should strike between safety, security, and data protection in crises like this one. It shows that it's important also to really break out misinformation from hate speech, clarify these differences, misinformation being considerably more complex. And also for instance, in the context of COVID, again, Facebook has this system of catching and removing content that would, for instance, lead people to not seek treatment when they should, and a few other issues. And much of the problematic content on this encrypted type messaging services come from users themselves. So this additionally shows that it should also be taken into account in terms of striking proportionality of responsibility and liability, and it shows that sharing that responsibility among actors is key. Another point I wanted to raise was that we tend to say platforms don't want to be arbiters of political truth, and they haven't really moved away from that with the crisis, because both the dangers and the truth are much clearer in that case, so it's a clear call, but that won't be the case for other issues. So now, quite importantly, the platforms were faced with the fact that they too must take responsibility. They need to support social distances, incentivize work from home, and to act urgently. So they need to work differently, and that includes having to rely more on those automated systems to help enforce their rules. Now, they had to take their actions themselves, using their own policies and standards for self-policing, which shows that these are relevant and pertinent standards. But it doesn't mean that it should be maintained as a standard and kept as regular practice afterwards. And by that, I mean that policies and rules shouldn't consider that using automated systems should be the norm and become an obligation. because as the platforms warn the public themselves, this might result in some mistakes. So filters remain rudimentary. The technology, again, is not a silver bullet, and not all companies can afford to use them efficiently. More broadly now, my final point is, well, this is a complex issue. It's great that the EU continues to take it seriously. And it's important to update something that was created 20 years ago, because the landscape has evolved. And I just wanted to make sure to mention that we published a report a few months ago on the Digital Services Act, in which we have a few recommendations. So in a nutshell, we would extend liability protections beyond passive services, harmonize the scope of covered online services, balance roles and responsibilities between public and private sectors, preserve the prohibition on monitoring obligations while increasing online platform transparency and holding companies responsible for timely removal of illegal content. And a couple more things where we want the adoption of standard technical measures to mitigate illegal content to be incentivized rather than forced. And also we point to pursuing non-regulatory solutions. So that would be it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Eline, for your inputs there. I believe we have just been joined now by our MEP, Karen Melchior. Karen, we're just starting with some opening statements from each of our panelists on the Digital Services Act in relation to European democracy. I'd like to give you the opportunity now, 2-3 minutes on the floor yourself, to give us an insight into your perspective as Shadow Rapporteur for the Legal Affairs Committee Initiative Report on the DSA.
I think it's, and thank you for having me on the panel, and sorry for being late. I think it's essential for the European democracy that we look at the platforms that we're using in our democratic dialogue, and that we make sure that the rights that we have in regards to being protected against hate speech or discrimination, or being allowed our freedom of expression, that this balance between rights is also respected on online platforms. This is important because we see that platforms have a dominant role in our democracies and our online lives. And that's why it's important that we have regulation that provides for protecting these rights when we're online as well as when we're offline. We see a tendency in the regulation that we've had so far, for example, the copyright regulation, of leaning towards having too much takedowns of material, rather than, because that's an easier solution for the platforms than it would be to look into what the balance of rights should be. And the e-commerce directive that we have in place at the moment only deals with two types of liability. Either you are not responsible as a platform, as a network, for the content at all, or you have the responsibility of an editor. And we need to find something in between, because the role of the platforms is different than the role of a neutral network that does not know what the content is, because the platforms choose to boost certain types of content and reduce the access or the distribution of other types of content. So that's why we need a regulation that will allow us to have an appropriate regulation for this kind of dealing with content, because platforms are neither news editors nor completely neutral networks, and we need a regulation that accommodates that. At the same time, we need to make sure that some of the very important principles from the e-commerce directive are maintained, such as the ban on general monitoring, and also the country of origin principle, where we say that the law of the land where we produce the content, that is the one that's supposed to be applied. Because I don't think that it is useful to say we should have a common European standards for what content should be allowed, because that would go to the lowest denominator. We would have the least amount of content being allowed, and that would be detrimental to our freedom of expression. Finally, it's also really important how this regulation is going to be applied by the platforms. We need to have transparency about the criteria that are being used. We need to have transparency about the methods and also about the appeals processes. I think it's important that we don't have privatization of our justice systems, because we need to have the same balance of rights as we have in our justice systems. And we also need to have transparency and accountability also when we're dealing with things online.
Great, thank you, Karen. You've given us a lot to get our teeth into there. Particularly, I'd like to actually take one of the points you brought up there and maybe address it to Prabhat in terms of the role of the platforms. Prabhat, how do you see the platforms having performed amid the current coronavirus outbreak in terms of the way that they've managed misinformation, the way in which content moderation has almost been outsourced to artificial intelligence machines? Could you give us an insight into some of the discussions in DG Connect at the moment and some of the reflections on the resilience of the online platforms amid the current coronavirus outbreak?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think we're still, it's early days. I mean, so at least in Europe, I think the crisis is pretty fresh, and every day there's a new piece of information. So we're certainly tracking what platforms are doing. My team is actually tracking it at the moment. We are also in contact with some, and the commissioner has also been in contact with some others. So that's working going on. I mean, I think it doesn't feel like it, but maybe it's worth, despite the crisis we're in, just to take a little bit of a step backwards. You know, it's 2020, and I think it's worth looking back how the system has evolved from over the last 5 years. You know, this is roughly the time that I've been dealing with this kind of work. You know, I think what we see today is that platforms are much better organized individually. We see that they are much more cooperative with each other. They're much more communicative towards us. And they're using the defense of the liability shield much less frequently about saying, you know, this is not something that we should be doing. So that's something that I think is like kind of then the last thing, exactly like you're saying, is that we've seen really kind of the emergence of automated content moderation and content moderation at scale come to the fore. I think today we see coronavirus now, the issues around content moderation and disinformation or automated takedowns, you know, after years of reflection on content moderations, you know, like that have been taking place in a variety of fora. And so in a way, we are kind of at a point where the conversation has become quite mature. So, you know, I think that the platforms are taking their responsibility much more seriously than was the case in the past. That's a good sign for us. Doesn't necessarily mean that we will regulate less or less heavily. You know, that's a totally an independent question. But I think that the kind of dialogue we have, the kind of transparency we have, is all going in the right direction. Now, there's a thing that is very difficult to ascertain. What is the difference between kind of the short-term response and the long-term effects and so on? And I think this is still early days to see. But it is an important question. I think everybody agrees with that our speech and information environment is being governed by these large platforms. It's also what Karen said earlier, you know, and the governance of this needs to be done right. And the Digital Services Act, you know, our objective is to get this governance right. There shouldn't be a decision monopoly on any of these things, either by the platforms or by the state actors. You know, so one principle which I kind of quite like is the no monopoly principle. You know, there's no single entity has all the power to take a host of decisions. You know, how exactly that will articulate itself in law, let's see. But you know, what we see, and we encourage platforms to take voluntary actions that they can take seriously, take legal obligations seriously, be transparent and communicate. So far, I mean, our initial assessment is that this is all happening. Whether it's enough to deal with the enormous challenges that we are facing right now, it remains to be seen. I think we'll have more and more formal and more structured conversations with the platforms over the next days as the dust settles a bit, you know. But that's a little bit my initial response to what we've been seeing.
Great, Prabhat. And you said earlier on that the public consultation, of course, was forthcoming. We've just had a question from one of our participants for a bit of clarity on this issue. I believe there were plans to expect the public consultation by the end of March. Is that still the case, or is it almost definitely likely to be pushed back now?
The right answer is, I mean, first of all, in brutal honesty, I don't have a definite answer. You know, like and the right answer is to the right answer is we're a little bit like in an airport situation, you know, where we are in the queue and ready to take off, you know, but we haven't got the signal from the control tower to take off. You know, this is a little bit the situation where we're in. And that's normal because the control tower is busy with some other emergencies, you know, but we're in the queue and we're ready to go when the control people tell us that this is the time to go. So that's the best I can give right now. And, you know, we'll communicate any updates, you know, as transparently as possible, but, you know, also trying to kind of limit the amount of misinformation that kind of that at source a little bit. So just be, you know, the honest answer is that we don't expect any massive delays because technically we're ready. We're pushing. There's some finishing touches being put onto the documents. Of course, we have a few more days, so we polish a little bit here and we polish a little bit more there, and so that's all in progress. There are no structural delays on our side. It's just you know, when the commission as a whole thinks that the moment is right, we'll go ahead with it.
Great, thank you, Prabhat, for that. Siada, I'd like to bring you back in here now to speak a bit more about responsibility. So, of course, the platforms have demonstrated a certain degree of responsibility in ensuring that the right information gets out to the public with regards to the coronavirus. But of course, in your recent online responsibility framework paper, you made quite a clear distinction between responsibility and liability. So Siada, perhaps you could talk us through that paper a bit more and tell us about this difference for you.
Of course, I would actually like to hook into a couple of the points that have already come up. So with the coronavirus instance, it's slightly different. So it highlights one of the areas that our industry more and more is becoming more vocal on, where exactly as Prabhat mentioned, the companies have come a long way in terms of just trying to stick to their initial position point of only talking about freedom of expression, the facilitating role of the platforms, where it was a number of years ago, to where we're now saying, well, we've always said we don't want to be judge and jury of content that's allowed to be online. And more so than ever, we need help in trying to figure out how to do this better, how to moderate better, how to collaborate with other stakeholders better. Why has it also been possible? And the companies have put massive effort into trying to decrease the amount of disinformation on the coronavirus. But why has that been possible? So I work a lot with the code of practice signatories, and they, from what I hear from them, it's because they have an ongoing working relationships with organizations such as the WHO, the connections with the ministries of health, to be able to demote the potentially dangerous content. And so by having a more systemic way of dealing with this, it makes it a lot quicker, it makes it a lot more efficient, and it doesn't leave it up to the platforms to decide what kind of content can stay up there, because that is not their role. They shouldn't be editing it, they shouldn't be making those choices necessarily. They want to definitely face their responsibility, but not to be the ones that are making the decisions on their own. Which is a slightly different situation than we had a year ago when we were preparing for the European elections, where a lot of it, because it was so close to the signature date of the Code of Practice, a lot of it was being developed as we went through the process, as we went through the prep of the European elections. And so we had these monthly reports going back to the Commission where you could see the development of the product as it was happening, but it was much more day to day. The other thing with regards to your point, Samuel, on responsibility versus liability. Liability is almost a punitive measure. The removal of your limited liability status as such could be seen as what not a punitive measure, an end game in terms of what that means for your service. What we're talking about is actually thinking about responsibility as you're rolling out your product and continuing to assess it based on observed impact. How do you do that? By working together with the regulator to provide transparency reports on what's been happening, trends that are coming up, where the services are, for example, being misused, and what kind of impact that can have. Because as I said, we're not working towards point X, but rather to a continued effort to improve the situation. And we're seeing the complexity to be able to do that, but the industry as a whole is turning to regulators, to other stakeholders to say, how can we do this better? And that's a big, big difference than 5 years ago.
Great. Thank you, Siada. Staying with the liability point, I'd like to bring Karen back in here. So we've heard different things from the Commission with regards to the limited liability exemptions included in the e-commerce framework. What's your take on how much the limited liability should be addressed in the DSA?
I think we need to look at liability again, but not necessarily undo the types of liability that we have in the e-commerce directive, but perhaps see if we want to have a sort of a third form of liability. There was also a question about whether the level of liability should be related to how active or passive a role the network or the platform takes. And I think this is one of the unfortunate incentives that there is in the current e-commerce directive, where platforms are actually have an incentive to not engage with the content that is on their platforms in order not to be liable for the content. And I think we need to have platforms that take responsibility and seek necessary information without general surveillance or monitoring. And the current legislation that we have at the moment does have a kind of perverse incentive to do less rather than the correct amount.
Great, thanks, Karen. And along that axis, Eline, when we're speaking about content moderation and perhaps what should be moderated in particular, Eline, on the subject of disinformation, how do you think the DSA could interact with the Code of Practice against disinformation? What lessons really should have been learned when the Code of Practice against disinformation was in use ahead of the European elections? Because I'm sure we all recall the erstwhile Commissioner Julian King criticising the reports of some of the platforms as, I think, patchy and opaque. So what's your take on how disinformation could be addressed as part of the DSA and its interaction with the Code of Practice?
Yeah, well, what would be saying is self-regulation, co-regulation, and voluntary frameworks are a good basis to start from because they enable all parties to learn, to share lessons, to profit from the experience of others, while improving existing practices or even developing new ones. So these approaches, to me, ensure an implementation of measures that's quite flexible, that involves the responsibility of all, that can simplify the rules, that can speed up adjustments and reduce legislative burden. And we've seen good improvements, and we've got good example with the Code of Practice and self-regulation can work. just because a couple of years ago there was just much less exchange of knowledge and best practices between policymakers and industry. So this has been very useful to establish some measures, boundaries, and really identify what is possible and what is less desirable. So I think the EU Code of Practice on Disinformation has shown that there's possibility to work together and act in coordination with tech experts and tackle complex issues like as complex as disinformation issues can be. Now, another thing that could help is also to clarify the definitions of illegal information and activities. So there needs to be a more inclusive set of definition to avoid the confusion and ambiguity that exists now. And there is really a difference, and it should be made clear, between the distribution of child pornography, trademark and copyright infringement, solicitation to commit a crime, incitement to violence, etc. So these are all important issues, and platforms have a responsibility to deal with that illegal content, but it's important not to conflate all these things. Also important to avoid things like a shopping list of harms. I think that's just also some of the proposals we've seen with the UK online harms white paper to impose also personal liability on executives. So.
Great, thanks, Eline. And of course, one has to wonder when thinking about the concept of self-regulation as whether the platform's responsibility and what they've done thus far amid the coronavirus outbreak will have an influence on how we regard the concept of self-regulation in these types of areas. Prabhat, I'd like to turn back to you for a bit more of a general question now. When we're talking about the e-commerce directive, of course, this remains the general framework for digital services in the EU. Since its introduction, however, some countries across the region have worked on updating their own solutions. Most recently, I'm thinking about France and Germany. Going back to the original basis of the DSA, what essentially are the flaws of the e-commerce directive that need to be fixed in the first place?
Yeah, I'm not sure I like the kind of conjunction that you're making implicitly between those national rules and the flaws of the e-commerce directive. You know, but I think, first of all, let's go back to what the original objectives were of the directive. You know, they're kind of threefold. One is there was to provide harmonized rules across the single market for services. I think most people agree that we're better off with common rules in the EU. Of course, that doesn't mean we have to kind of steamroller over national differences in what constitutes hate speech or defamation. Some countries have laws on defamations, others don't, and so on. We're not trying to kind of, you know, smoothen all of these differences out there. A lot of them have a kind of deeply rooted in local history. I mean, take for example the the histories of, you know, Nazi symbols in Germany. You know, there's specific reason why that's illegal in Germany and not necessarily elsewhere. Just so, but what can be guaranteed and what should perhaps be guaranteed is to ensure that services, digital services, can be provided freely across borders. So that's kind of objective number one. Objective number two was to provide a framework to deal with illegal content, which is the liability exemption that we kind of dealt with. And objective three was to kind of put in some safeguards for fundamental rights, notably freedom of expression online, as people recognize that you know, what you post on social media or what you upload on the web is a form of expression, so it needs to be protected by some way. So those objectives, to be very honest, in our view, they are still pretty good objectives. So new objectives like helping fight, you know, platforms against resilience, you know, against manipulation from other actors, you know, like, so better interaction between the platforms and public authorities. So there might be newer objectives there, but the original core objectives of the e-commerce directive, in our view, they're pretty sound and they're pretty solid. Now, to answer your question, what are the flaws? I mean, some member states like Germany and France, they've decided that they needed to regulate, I think partly out of a frustration of not getting their issues resolved. You know, like And so, you know, in Germany, we work very closely with the German government. There was an issue in kind of right-wing hate speech directed at frequently at immigrants. You know, this stuff wasn't being removed, even though it's illegal in Germany at the time when the first NetzDG kind of was national law. And it was felt that the kind of interaction at EU level wasn't effective enough for them to kind of rely on action at EU level. So that's why they passed the national law. In France, very similar right now. So what are the defects? I think, well, one is, I think, you know, there isn't really a clear binding procedure for how to deal with illegal content in the e-commerce directive. This, by the way, was already recognized way back in 2000. So this isn't particularly original. It's not particularly new. I mean, people 20 years ago already said this, you know, so this is an obvious defect of the e-commerce directive. There are some other defects. I don't think that we have a good framework for oversight. Siada already mentioned it right at the beginning. I don't think that we have a good framework for transparency. It's also not really regulated in the e-commerce directive, you know, and we started out this conversation around all these automated decision makings around content moderation, you know, is that it's not necessarily a matter of whether we want automated content moderation or not. I don't think there is much choice, but who decides, you know, who has the transparency obligations, and none of this is really regulated in the e-commerce directive. So I can go on and on and on, but I think these are some of the issues which I think should be regulated now at EU level, and should make it should make the framework more powerful and more robust and more adapted, quite frankly, to today's challenges.
Great, thanks, Prabhat. One issue that we haven't really addressed, Karen, is political advertising. And of course, in your role as a member of the European Parliament, political advertising can have a direct impact on your area of work in particular. So, Karen, what's your opinion on to the extent to which political advertising should be addressed in the Digital Services Act?
I think that political advertising, just as any other content, should be addressed in the Act. I think it is going to be very difficult to have regulation, particularly on political advertisement, because the definition of what is political advertisement and what is political opinions of something that is not a political party, but for example, a trade union, is very different according to who reads it and also according to which country you're looking at. We saw the problem with the regulation of platforms of political advertisement during the European election campaign, where regulation was applied that does not take into account the European reality of a European election. And I think it is the same requirements that we have to others, we should also apply to politicians. We shouldn't be encouraging hate speech. We should not be lying. We should be factual. Of course, we should have our opinions. But as somebody said, you have the right to your own opinion, but you don't have the right to your own facts. And this should apply to politicians as well as everybody else. So I don't think we should get a get out of jail card free for politicians. We should actually perhaps be looking at having a higher level of responsibility for politicians. But I think this is something perhaps not linked to the exact content moderation aspect, because I think that the same rules should apply to political content as other types of content, because it will be too complicated and too dependent on national legislation to look and context to look at what is political advertisement and what is non-political advertisement. So that's why I think it's actually more interesting to look at the general regulation of content and advertisement than looking at solely political advertisement.
Great, thanks, Karen. And jumping now from political ads to hate speech, I'd like to turn to Siada. And of course, we've seen various initiatives pushed by member states to combat hate speech, particularly in France. What kinds of measures do you think that the platforms could put in place to fight these threats? And what are the vulnerabilities for the platforms of dealing with hate speech in general?
So thanks for asking that question, because it actually raises the whole issue between having to make a distinction between what is illegal content and what isn't. And hate speech isn't always illegal. It is in some instances, but not always, depending on what it is. And that is exactly where the complexity comes in on how the platforms can act. That's also why we say we understand the concerns with regards to hate speech. We understand that France and Germany have wanted to work on this. Germany has at least got very clearly defined criteria that would define what hate speech entails. But what our concern is with regards to potentially pulling that into the DSA initiatives is that we're going to extend the scope into an area where we don't have EU definitions. And so we will try and fix a problem that we can't define. It'll be a moving target where it's trial and error. And instead of us being effective, we will have to go into trying to comply rather than to try and find solutions all the time. And so that's why what EDiMA's standpoint is let's start the focus with where we have clear definitions, which is illegal content. That's where we've got definitions at least at national level, where we've got some clarity, and then potentially continue exploration as to what is possible at EU level on hate speech, not because of a lack of willingness to do something, but we're going to be going into uncharted territory where because of liability, because of the impact on freedom of expression, companies will have to be more cautious as to what they can or can't do because of the lack of definition.
Okay, great. Thank you, Siada. We are rapidly running out of time. I'm afraid it has transpired that we need a lot more than 45 minutes to wrap up this discussion. But before we close, I would like to return to each of our panelists to deliver a short closing statement on the DSA. Try to keep it short and sweet, 30 seconds. Let's start with Eline first, please.
Well, I'll get back to what I mentioned, some of the points that we make in our reports, that it would be a good idea to harmonize the scope of covered online services to extend to more than just hosting providers and account for their diversity, clarify the definitions of what is legal and what isn't. And Siada, I definitely concur with what you just mentioned. When it comes to transparency, which we haven't necessarily discussed thoroughly, I think it's important to discuss what kind of transparency we're talking about, what kind of data, what for. That depends also on the type of provider. And also definitely try to aim for some sort of common EU effort in this. I mean, we're talking a lot about how the EU is trying to reach for digital leadership. I think regulatory consistency and making sure we're not replicating existing legislation is very important.
Great, thank you, Eline. Karen, could we hear your closing statement, please?
I think it's really important that we focus on the principles and the processes and the methods that we want to regulate content on platforms with. And then the content will regulate itself. And then we have a responsibility as politicians to be able to take the difficult decisions, because otherwise the platforms will take it for us. And I think it's our duty as a society and as politicians to take those decisions and not the platforms.
Thank you, Karen. If I could turn to Siada now.
Okay, sorry about that technical glitch. But yeah, from our perspective, let's really use this opportunity to potentially look at a more ambitious approach to really deal with content moderation. So not think of just short-term goals of updating legislation X or Y, but rather let's try and think of what framework we need to have in place to do this in a better way for the long term, bearing in mind that the reality of the technology is going to be completely different by the time any piece of legislation is going to hit the ground.
Great, thank you. And Prabhat, your closing statement, please.
Well, I think I agree with a lot that has been said. I think my perspective is just slightly different. I think that there's going to be another crisis next year and the year afterwards, and a good framework. What does success look like? Is that I think gives us reasonable reassurance that we have a kind of a formal binding framework that allows companies to respond quickly and effectively, but give the public authorities enough control, insight, oversight, leverage, cooperation mechanisms, all of these things are not a bigger toolbox to engage with these important information intermediaries. And I think that the one thing that we shouldn't forget is that Europe is not only made of big platforms like Facebook and YouTube, but also made up of a lot of small ones. And maybe the objectives are not always the same. You know, like we probably want for the big ones a framework that allows us a greater degree of control and accountability. I think maybe that's my main word. And for the smaller ones, a greater opportunity to kind of grow and to scale up in a single market. So with that, I think those are kind of my thoughts at this particular point.
Great. Thank you very much, Prabhat. And a big thank you to all our panelists for taking part in today's session. It's been a very successful digital day, and it's still not over yet at Cybersec. So please stay online and check out the remaining panels. Stay safe. And with that, I would like to hand you back to Barbara and the Cybersec team. Thank you very much.